Picture this. A respected Swiss psychiatrist sitting in his study in 1912, surrounded by patient files that would forever change our understanding of the human psyche. Carl Gustav Jung had just made a discovery so radical, so potentially dangerous to the established order of psychology, that it would cost him his relationship with Sigmund Freud and thrust him into what he would later call his own confrontation with the unconscious. What Jung discovered was not just another psychological theory. It was a shocking truth about human nature that most people spend their entire lives desperately trying to avoid. The truth Jung uncovered was this: within every human being lives what he termed the shadow, a dark, primitive, and often repulsive aspect of our personality that contains everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. But here's where Jung's insight becomes truly revolutionary and disturbing to conventional thinking. He argued that we must not only acknowledge this shadow self, we must learn to love it, integrate it, and make peace with the very parts of ourselves we've been taught to despise. Jung's journey into this forbidden territory began with his own psychological breakdown between 1913 and 1917. After his split with Freud, Jung found himself plunging into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. He began experiencing vivid dreams, terrifying visions, and encounters with figures from his own psyche that seemed to have lives of their own. Most psychiatrists of his era would have diagnosed themselves as psychotic and sought immediate treatment. Jung did something far more dangerous. He decided to explore these phenomena, to dialogue with them, to understand what his psyche was trying to tell him. During this period, Jung created what he called the Red Book, a leather-bound journal where he recorded his conversations with the figures emerging from his unconscious. These weren't mere hallucinations or products of mental illness, Jung realized. They were autonomous aspects of his own personality that had been split off, repressed, and forced into the darkness of the unconscious mind. Among these figures was his own shadow, everything about himself he had deemed unacceptable, immoral, or incompatible with his image as a respectable doctor and scholar. What Jung discovered through this harrowing self-exploration was that the shadow isn't simply a repository of our negative traits. It's far more complex and paradoxical than that. The shadow contains not only our repressed vices and destructive impulses, but also our unlived potential. Our creative energies that have been deemed inappropriate by society, and aspects of our authentic self that we've sacrificed in order to fit in and be accepted by others. Consider how this works in practical terms. A woman raised in a highly religious household might repress her sexuality, her anger, her ambition, or her irreverent sense of humor because these qualities are deemed sinful or inappropriate. These rejected aspects don't disappear. They go underground, forming part of her shadow. Years later, she might find herself inexplicably attracted to people who embody these very qualities she's repressed in herself. She might judge them harshly, while simultaneously being fascinated by their freedom to express what she cannot. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his clinical practice. Patients would come to him complaining about other people, spouses who were too sexual, colleagues who were too aggressive, friends who were too selfish. Through careful analysis, Jung helped them recognize that what they found most disturbing in others were often projections of their own disowned shadow material. The things we hate most in others, Jung suggested, are frequently the very things we've rejected about ourselves. But Jung's insight went deeper than simply recognizing projection. He realized that this psychological splitting, the division of ourselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts, was at the root of much human suffering. When we reject aspects of ourselves and force them into the shadow, we don't eliminate them. Instead, we give them autonomous power over our lives. The shadow doesn't remain passive. It influences our behavior in unconscious ways, often sabotaging our conscious intentions and creating the very situations we most want to avoid. The alcoholic who swears off drinking but finds himself in bars. The faithful spouse who condemns adultery but engages in emotional affairs. The peaceful person who explodes in unexpected rage. The generous individual who acts with surprising selfishness. These aren't simply moral failures or character flaws. They're often the shadow asserting its denied existence, demanding recognition and integration. Jung's revolutionary solution was counterintuitive and deeply unsettling to the moral sensibilities of his time. Instead of continuing the battle against our darker impulses, instead of strengthening our defenses against the unacceptable parts of ourselves, Jung proposed something radical. We must learn to love our shadow, to embrace it as an essential part of our wholeness, to integrate it consciously, rather than allowing it to operate from the darkness. This doesn't mean acting out every impulse or abandoning all moral restraint. Jung wasn't advocating for a life of hedonistic abandon or encouraging people to harm others. What he was suggesting was far more sophisticated and ultimately more challenging. The conscious integration of our shadow material through awareness, dialogue, and acceptance. He called this process individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness that requires us to reclaim all the rejected parts of ourselves. The process Jung described is neither simple nor comfortable. It requires us to confront aspects of ourselves that we've spent years or even decades trying to deny, repress, or eliminate. It means acknowledging that we contain the capacity for behaviors and feelings that contradict our idealized self-image. The person who prides himself on being rational must acknowledge his irrational impulses. The individual who sees herself as purely good must face her capacity for cruelty. The one who appears strong must accept his vulnerability and neediness. Jung discovered that this integration process often begins with what he called shadow encounters, moments when our repressed material breaks through our conscious defenses. These might manifest as dreams, where we behave in ways that horrify our waking self, slips of the tongue that reveal hidden hostilities, or intense emotional reactions to situations that seem to warrant a much milder response. These breakthrough moments, uncomfortable as they are, provide opportunities for consciousness to expand and include previously rejected material. One of Jung's most important insights was that the shadow contains not only negative traits, but also positive qualities that we've rejected because they don't fit our persona, the mask we wear in social situations. A man raised to be tough and emotionally controlled might repress his sensitivity, compassion, and artistic nature. A woman taught to be sweet and accommodating might push down her assertiveness, intellectual ambition, and leadership capabilities. These positive shadow qualities often emerge in our dreams, in our secret fantasies, or in our admiration for others who embody these traits. The integration of shadow material requires what Jung called active imagination, a technique involving conscious dialogue with the figures and impulses emerging from the unconscious. Rather than trying to eliminate or control these aspects, Jung encouraged people to engage with them, to understand their purpose, to negotiate with them. This might involve imaginary conversations with the critical voice inside our head, creative expression of repressed emotions, or conscious exploration of rejected desires in safe, contained ways. Jung emphasized that shadow integration is not a one-time event, but a lifelong process. As we grow and encounter new situations, new aspects of our shadow material may emerge. The successful business executive might discover previously unknown creative impulses in midlife. The devoted parent might uncover suppressed needs for independence and adventure. The rational scientist might encounter mystical or spiritual longings that challenge his worldview. The therapeutic process Jung developed involved helping patients recognize their projections, identify their shadow material, and find ways to consciously integrate these rejected aspects. This often meant helping people see how their symptoms, relationship problems, and life difficulties were connected to their unconscious rejection of parts of themselves. Depression might be linked to repressed anger or grief. Anxiety might stem from disowned excitement or passion. Relationship conflicts might reflect the projection of shadow material onto partners. Jung's approach was radically different from other therapeutic methods of his time. Instead of focusing solely on symptom reduction or behavioral change, Jung was interested in the expansion of consciousness and the integration of the total personality. He believed that many psychological symptoms were actually attempts by the psyche to restore balance and wholeness. The neurotic symptom, the disturbing dream, the inexplicable attraction or aversion, these were all communications from the shadow self, demanding attention and integration. What made Jung's approach truly revolutionary was his understanding that the shadow is not an enemy to be conquered, but a part of ourselves to be befriended. This shift in perspective changes everything about how we approach personal growth and psychological healing. Instead of engaging in endless battles with our darker impulses, instead of exhausting ourselves with attempts at self-improvement that ignore essential aspects of our nature, Jung proposed a path of acceptance, dialogue, and integration. The implications of this approach extend far beyond individual therapy. Jung recognized that the same dynamics operating in individual psychology also play out on a collective level. Societies, cultures, and nations also have shadow material, aspects of human nature that are collectively repressed, projected onto other groups, and acted out in unconscious ways. The phenomenon of scapegoating, where a group projects its disowned negative traits onto another group, is a collective expression of shadow projection. Wars, persecution, and social conflicts often involve the projection of a collective shadow onto the designated enemy. Jung's insight suggests that many of our social and political problems stem from our collective inability to acknowledge and integrate our shadow material. The same process that creates individual neurosis also creates collective madness. The cure, Jung suggested, is not the elimination of our darker impulses, but their conscious recognition and integration. When we stop projecting our shadow onto others, when we take responsibility for our own capacity for evil, greed, violence, and irrationality, we begin to create the possibility for genuine peace and social harmony. This brings us to perhaps the most shocking aspect of Jung's truth: the realization that our enemies, whether personal or collective, often carry our disowned shadow material. The person we most despise, the group we most fear, the political ideology we most oppose, these may all be carrying aspects of ourselves that we've refused to acknowledge. This doesn't mean that all conflicts are simply psychological projections, or that there are no real differences between people and groups. But it does suggest that many of our most intense hatreds and fears have a psychological component that we ignore at our peril. Jung's work suggests that true maturity, both individual and collective, requires what he called the withdrawal of projections, the process of recognizing and reclaiming the shadow material we've projected onto others. This is perhaps one of the most difficult tasks a human being can undertake, because it requires us to acknowledge that we contain the very qualities we've condemned in others. It means recognizing that the capacity for evil we see in our enemies also exists within ourselves. It means accepting that we are not as pure, as good, or as rational as we'd like to believe. The process of shadow integration is made more difficult by the fact that our culture and social institutions often encourage shadow projection rather than integration. Political systems thrive on the creation of enemies onto whom we can project our collective shadow. Religious institutions sometimes promote the splitting of human nature into good and evil, encouraging the repression of natural impulses rather than their conscious integration. Educational systems often reward conformity and the suppression of aspects of personality that don't fit societal norms. Jung's approach requires a fundamental shift in how we understand morality and personal development. Instead of seeing life as a battle between good and evil, between our higher and lower natures, Jung proposed understanding life as a process of integration and wholeness. This doesn't mean abandoning moral values or ethical principles. Rather, it means holding these values consciously, while also acknowledging the aspects of ourselves that might violate them. It means making conscious choices about how we express our various impulses rather than pretending some impulses don't exist. The first part of Jung's shocking truth culminates in this recognition. The enemy within us is not something to be destroyed, but something to be understood, engaged with, and ultimately loved. This love is not sentimental affection, but a mature acceptance of the totality of our being. It's the recognition that we cannot become whole by rejecting parts of ourselves, that we cannot achieve genuine peace by making war on our own nature, and that the path to psychological health requires the integration of everything we are, including everything we wish we weren't. This sets the stage for the even more challenging territory we'll explore in the second part of our journey: the practical process of how we actually undertake this integration, the specific techniques Jung developed for befriending our shadow, and the profound transformations that become possible when we stop fighting the enemy within and start learning to love the very aspects of ourselves we've been taught to despise. How does one learn to love the enemy within? How do we move from intellectual understanding to lived transformation? Jung's approach was not merely theoretical, it was deeply practical, emerging from his own harrowing journey through what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, and refined through decades of clinical work with patients undertaking their own individuation process. The integration of shadow material begins with what Jung called the recognition phase. This involves developing the capacity to see our own projections in the world around us. Jung observed that we tend to notice and react strongly to qualities in others that we've disowned in ourselves. The person who triggers our strongest negative reactions often carries some aspect of our own rejected nature. This isn't always immediately obvious because our projections are often disguised or distorted by our psychological defenses. Consider the phenomenon Jung observed in his practice. The patient who complained bitterly about her mother's manipulative behavior while remaining completely blind to her own subtle forms of manipulation. The recognition phase would involve helping this patient see how her intense reaction to her mother's behavior might be connected to her own disowned, manipulative tendencies. This doesn't mean that her mother isn't actually manipulative, but rather that the intensity of her reaction and her particular sensitivity to this behavior suggests a psychological component that warrants exploration. Jung developed several techniques to help people recognize their projections and identify their shadow material. Dream analysis was central to his approach, because dreams often present us with images of ourselves behaving in ways that contradict our conscious self-image. The gentle person dreams of committing violent acts. The moral individual dreams of sexual encounters that violate their ethical code. The rational thinker dreams of engaging in magical or supernatural activities. Rather than dismissing these dreams as meaningless or disturbing, Jung encouraged people to explore what these shadow figures might be trying to communicate. Active imagination was another crucial technique Jung developed for shadow integration. This involved consciously entering into dialogue with the figures, voices, and impulses emerging from the unconscious. Rather than trying to suppress or control these elements, active imagination involves engaging with them as if they were real, autonomous beings with their own perspectives and needs. This might involve writing dialogues between your conscious self and your critical inner voice, creating artistic expressions of repressed emotions, or engaging in imaginary conversations with the aspects of yourself you've rejected. The process of active imagination often begins with identifying a particular shadow figure or impulse that has been causing difficulty in your life. This might be the voice that constantly criticizes your efforts, the impulse toward behaviors you've deemed unacceptable, or the part of yourself that acts in ways contrary to your conscious intentions. Instead of trying to eliminate this aspect, active imagination involves approaching it with curiosity and genuine interest in understanding its purpose and perspective. Jung discovered that shadow figures often contain important information about our unlived potential and repressed needs. The critical voice might actually be trying to protect us from failure or rejection. The destructive impulse might be a distorted expression of our need for freedom or authenticity. The selfish tendency might be attempting to ensure that our legitimate needs are met in a world that has taught us that self-care is selfish. Through dialogue with these aspects, we can begin to understand their deeper purpose and find healthier ways to honor their underlying needs. One of Jung's most important insights was that shadow integration requires a fundamental shift in our relationship to suffering and difficulty. Rather than seeing problems, symptoms, and conflicts as things to be eliminated, Jung encouraged people to understand them as communications from the unconscious, attempts by the psyche to restore balance and promote growth. This perspective transforms our relationship to our own psychological struggles from one of warfare to one of collaboration. The integration process often involves what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposing forces in consciousness simultaneously without being torn apart by the conflict. This requires developing a kind of psychological flexibility that allows us to acknowledge contradictory aspects of our nature without immediately needing to resolve the tension. We can be both generous and selfish, both loving and hateful, both rational and irrational, both strong and vulnerable. The transcendent function allows us to hold these paradoxes consciously, rather than splitting them off into acceptable and unacceptable categories. Jung emphasized that shadow integration is not about expressing every impulse or acting on every desire. The goal is not to become unconsciously ruled by our shadow material, but to become consciously related to it. This might involve finding creative and constructive outlets for shadow energies, setting appropriate boundaries on shadow expression, or using shadow material as a source of energy and creativity rather than allowing it to undermine our conscious intentions. For example, someone who has repressed their aggressive impulses might learn to channel this energy into assertiveness in appropriate situations, competitive sports, creative endeavors, or social activism. The key is conscious choice rather than unconscious acting out. By acknowledging and accepting our aggressive impulses, we can choose how to express them in ways that serve our conscious goals rather than being surprised by explosive outbursts or passive-aggressive behavior. The integration process also involves what Jung called the relativization of the ego. The ego, our conscious sense of self, often believes it should be in complete control of our psychological life. Shadow integration requires recognizing that the ego is only one part of the total personality, and that trying to maintain total conscious control often creates the very problems we're trying to solve. This doesn't mean abandoning conscious choice and responsibility, but rather expanding our understanding of what constitutes our total self. Jung observed that many people resist shadow integration because they fear it will lead to moral relativism or the abandonment of ethical principles. This fear misunderstands the nature of the integration process. Acknowledging our capacity for behavior that violates our values doesn't mean we must act on these impulses. Rather, it means making conscious choices about our behavior while being honest about the full range of our psychological makeup. This actually strengthens our ethical capacity because it's based on conscious choice rather than unconscious repression. The therapeutic relationship Jung developed was specifically designed to support the integration process. Unlike therapeutic approaches that position the therapist as an expert who diagnoses and treats the patient's problems, Jung's approach involved what he called the dialectical relationship, a genuine encounter between two people, each with their own psychological complexity. Jung recognized that he couldn't help patients integrate their shadow material unless he was actively engaged in his own integration process. This led Jung to develop what he called the wounded healer archetype, the recognition that effective healing requires the healer to acknowledge and work with their own psychological wounds and shadow material. The therapist who has never confronted their own darkness, Jung argued, cannot truly help others navigate their shadow terrain. This insight revolutionized the practice of psychotherapy and established the importance of ongoing personal work for mental health professionals. Jung's approach to shadow integration also involved understanding the collective and cultural dimensions of our personal shadow material. Many aspects of our individual shadow are actually reflections of collective repressions, qualities that our culture, family system, or social group has deemed unacceptable. The integration process often involves questioning these collective judgments and developing our own relationship to various aspects of human nature. For instance, a person raised in a culture that highly values emotional control might have repressed their capacity for emotional expression and spontaneity. Shadow integration would involve not just acknowledging these repressed qualities, but also examining the cultural messages that led to their repression in the first place. This might involve developing a more nuanced understanding of when emotional expression is appropriate and healthy versus when emotional control serves important functions. Jung also recognized that shadow integration is not a solitary process. We often need the help of others to recognize our projections and blind spots. Intimate relationships, in particular, provide ongoing opportunities for shadow recognition and integration. Our partners, friends, and family members often trigger our shadow material and provide feedback about aspects of ourselves we can't see clearly. This is why Jung viewed relationships not just as sources of happiness and support, but as crucial contexts for psychological development. The integration process Jung described often involves what he called the dark night of the soul, periods of intense psychological difficulty when our established sense of self is challenged by emerging shadow material. These periods can involve depression, anxiety, confusion, and a sense of losing one's psychological moorings. Rather than seeing these experiences as pathological, Jung understood them as necessary phases in the individuation process, times when the psyche is reorganizing itself around a more inclusive sense of identity. During these challenging periods, Jung emphasized the importance of what he called holding the tension, neither acting out unconsciously nor repressing the emerging material, but allowing the psychological conflict to exist consciously until a new synthesis emerges. This requires considerable psychological courage and often benefits from therapeutic support or other forms of conscious guidance. Jung observed that shadow integration often proceeds in waves or cycles rather than as a linear progression. Just when we think we've integrated a particular aspect of our shadow, new situations or life transitions can activate previously unknown shadow material. The empty nest parent discovers repressed career ambitions. The successful executive encounters spiritual longings that challenge their materialistic worldview. The rational skeptic experiences mystical encounters that threaten their scientific orientation. These ongoing encounters with shadow material are not signs of failure in the integration process, but rather evidence of the psyche's continued growth and development. Jung viewed the individuation process as lifelong, with shadow integration being an ongoing aspect of psychological maturity rather than a problem to be solved once and for all. The practical techniques Jung developed for shadow integration evolved throughout his career and were refined through his work with hundreds of patients. In addition to dream analysis and active imagination, Jung utilized artistic expression, body awareness, ritual and ceremony, and what he called amplification, the process of connecting personal psychological material to broader cultural and mythological themes. Jung discovered that shadow material often connects to archetypal patterns, universal themes in human psychology that appear across cultures and throughout history. The shadow often contains not just personal rejected material, but also connections to archetypal energies that have been collectively repressed in our particular culture or historical period. Understanding these archetypal dimensions can help normalize and contextualize our personal shadow work. For example, someone struggling with repressed anger might benefit from exploring cultural and mythological representations of healthy anger and righteous indignation. This can help them understand that their anger might not be a personal defect, but rather a natural human response that needs conscious expression. Similarly, someone dealing with repressed sexuality might explore how different cultures have understood and honored sexual energy as a creative and spiritual force. Jung's approach to shadow integration ultimately aimed at what he called the realization of the self, the achievement of psychological wholeness through the integration of all aspects of personality, including those we've previously rejected. The self, in Jung's understanding, is not the ego or conscious personality, but rather the totality of our being, including both conscious and unconscious elements. The integration of shadow material is essential to self-realization because we cannot become whole while rejecting essential parts of our nature. This process of self-realization through shadow integration has profound implications for how we understand success, happiness, and the good life. Rather than pursuing an idealized version of ourselves that excludes our darker impulses, Jung's approach suggests that genuine fulfillment comes through embracing our total complexity. This doesn't mean being ruled by our shadow material, but rather including it consciously in our understanding of who we are. The transformation that becomes possible through shadow integration is often surprising and paradoxical. People discover that accepting their capacity for selfishness actually makes them more genuinely generous. Acknowledging their potential for cruelty increases their authentic compassion. Embracing their vulnerability strengthens their real power. This occurs because energy that was previously tied up in repression and internal conflict becomes available for creative and constructive purposes. Jung's shocking truth about loving the enemy within ultimately points toward a radical reconceptualization of human nature and personal development. Instead of seeing ourselves as fundamentally divided between good and evil aspects, instead of pursuing self-improvement through the elimination of undesirable traits, Jung's approach suggests that our path to wholeness lies through integration and acceptance of our total complexity. This doesn't mean abandoning discernment or moral judgment, but rather making these choices from a place of conscious awareness rather than unconscious repression. When we know and accept our capacity for various behaviors and feelings, we can make authentic choices about how to express our nature. When we're driven by unconscious rejection of parts of ourselves, our choices are constrained by our internal conflicts and projections. The implications of Jung's approach extend far beyond individual psychology to encompass our relationships, our communities, and our collective human challenges. When we stop projecting our shadow material onto others, we create the possibility for genuine dialogue and understanding. When we take responsibility for our own capacity for the behaviors we condemn in others, we begin to address social problems at their psychological roots. Jung's work suggests that many of our personal and collective difficulties stem from our refusal to acknowledge and consciously integrate the full spectrum of human nature. The path forward, according to Jung's shocking truth, lies not in becoming better people in the conventional sense, but in becoming more complete people. Individuals who can love and integrate even the enemy within themselves. This is perhaps the most radical and transformative insight in the history of psychology. That our salvation lies not in the elimination of our darkness, but in learning to consciously embrace the totality of what we are.